Imagine the world around 10,000 years ago. The Earth was changing rapidly. Glaciers were melting, forests were returning, and humans had already spread across nearly every corner of the planet. We were emerging from the last ice age, stepping into a new era filled with dramatic transformations in climate, technology, and lifestyle. This was when the first real foundations of civilization began to take shape. Tools were getting more advanced, people were starting to settle down, and most importantly, agriculture, the root of modern society, was beginning to take hold. It was one of the biggest turning points in human history. Of course, not every important discovery or event happened exactly 10,000 years ago. Archaeological sites and cultural changes don't fit neatly into one specific year. So to understand this period more clearly, we'll be looking at the broader range, about 12,000 to 8,000 years ago. That gives us a better view of what humanity was actually doing during this key transition in history. Back then, the climate was changing dramatically. For tens of thousands of years, the planet was locked in a deep freeze, covered in massive glaciers. But around 11,700 years ago, Earth's orbit began to shift, triggering a natural warming phase. The Ice Age ended, and the Holocene epoch began. Melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise, about 7.5 meters or 24 feet in just under 2 centuries. Even so, sea levels were still lower than they are today. That meant many regions that are now underwater were still dry land back then. People were living on those lands, hunting, gathering, and building early cultures. The loss of those regions as the waters rose would have had a huge impact on where people could live, hunt, and grow food. But it wasn't just about the environment, humans themselves were starting to change how they lived. This was the dawn of the agricultural revolution. People stopped roaming the land full-time and started planting crops, raising animals, and building more permanent homes. That shift is known as the Neolithic Revolution. It didn't happen everywhere at once. In West Asia, around 10,000 years ago, early farmers began domesticating plants like wheat, barley, lentils, and flax. But agriculture also emerged independently in other parts of the world. Africa, the Americas, Southeast Asia, and New Guinea, all developing their own staple crops. Each region had different resources and different timelines, but the changes were equally profound. This revolution didn't just change how we got food, it changed everything. It laid the groundwork for population growth, village life, social hierarchies, and the birth of civilizations. But it came with a price. Health actually declined in many early farming communities. Diets became less diverse, relying heavily on grains and starches instead of a wide variety of wild plants and animals. Living close together in settled villages meant diseases spread more easily. And farming itself was hard work. Let's begin our journey through some of the fascinating cultures that existed around 10,000 years ago. One of the most intriguing lost worlds from this time is a place called Doggerland. Doggerland used to lie between modern-day Britain and mainland Europe. Back then, it wasn't underwater. It was a vast stretch of grasslands, forests, and wetlands connecting the two landmasses. People lived there, hunted, fished, and built lives in what was once a thriving ecosystem. Today, it's all at the bottom of the North Sea, submerged by the rising waters that followed the end of the Ice Age. One of the cultures that called Doggerland home was the Megalmajin culture. These people descended from earlier groups who had hunted Ice Age megafauna like mammoths and cave bears. But as the climate warmed and those giant animals disappeared, Megalmajin communities had to adapt. They shifted away from specialized big game hunting and embraced a more flexible hunter-gatherer lifestyle. This period is what archaeologists refer to as the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age. It's a time of innovation, adaptation, and resilience. People weren't just surviving, they were refining their tools, developing social systems, and getting smarter about how they used the land. The Megalmojins and other groups during this time began crafting incredibly sophisticated tools from stone, antler, and bone. One major innovation was the microlith, small, sharp stone blades that could be set into wood or bone to make complex tools like arrows, spears, and fishing gear. They also carved antlers into axes, digging sticks, and even weapons. One of the first clear signs of warfare comes from this era. Archaeologists have found round stones with central holes that appear to be mace heads, clubs designed not just for hunting but for fighting. These weren't random rocks. They were carefully shaped, drilled, and likely mounted on handles. It suggests organized violence was becoming part of human life, even before cities and armies. Despite that, much of life in the Mesolithic was deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. These people hunted deer, bison, aurochs, and especially reindeer, which still roamed large parts of northern Europe at the time. A recent discovery off the coast of Germany adds a fascinating twist to this story. Under the Baltic Sea, archaeologists uncovered a long stone wall, nearly a kilometer in length, built over 10,000 years ago. Its purpose? Most likely, it was used to guide reindeer or other animals into traps or ambush points. Think about that, these people were constructing massive structures underwater. Well, it was dry land back then, all to coordinate large-scale hunts. It wasn't just one person with a spear anymore. This was strategy, teamwork, planning. That kind of thinking is a huge part of what makes us human. Similar tactics have been used by other cultures throughout history. In Siberia and the Arctic, the Inuit would guide caribou toward lakes, where hunters in kayaks could easily pick them off. The same principles may have applied to these ancient European groups. Further north, in what is now Scandinavia, another culture began to emerge. For a long time, scholars assumed that places inside the Arctic Circle were uninhabitable 10,000 years ago. But discoveries have proven otherwise. The people of the Kamsa culture moved into the area surprisingly early, possibly with the help of watercraft. They reached as far as Finnmark in northern Norway. These early Arctic settlers crafted beautifully made harpoons, likely for fishing and hunting sea mammals. But they weren't just practical, they were artists, too. They carved elaborate engravings and painted images on stone. Some of their rock art even includes scenes that appeared to depict battles. One cave painting shows 3 archers encircled by a group of 4. It looks like a skirmish, a confrontation frozen in time. What's interesting is that this kind of group violence, especially with bows and arrows, was previously thought to be more common in later societies like the Indo-European steppe herders or early Anatolian farmers. But this painting pushes that timeline back. This period also included a group known as the Eastern hunter-gatherers, ancestors of the Indo-European steppe people. They were spread across northern Asia and Eastern Europe, had darker hair and eyes, and relatively lighter skin compared to earlier human populations. They intermingled with Western hunter-gatherers to form new cultural blends across the continent. Another group, the Swiderian culture, lived in what is now Eastern Europe and parts of Russia. They created their own distinctive stone tools and lived by hunting the animals that had begun repopulating the warming forests of the post-glacial world. There's also some evidence to suggest that early symbolic objects were created around this time. In one region, researchers found a carved wooden figure made from a large tree trunk. It was shaped using polished adzes, possibly even using tools fashioned from beaver jaws. This wasn't a tool or weapon, it was likely a spiritual object, comparable to totem poles later seen among indigenous peoples like the Haida in Canada. So what do we see here? A Europe that was anything but primitive. These people were building, organizing, innovating. They lived close to the land but had rich symbolic worlds. They were artists, hunters, and builders, living in a time that balanced survival with meaning. We often imagine the past as brutal and basic, but 10,000 years ago, even without cities or metal tools, humans were already tapping into the full range of creativity, cooperation, and complexity that still defines us today. Let's move now from the forests and coasts of Europe to one of the cradles of settled life, Jericho. Situated in the Jordan Valley, this site is often considered one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. By around 11,000 years ago, people had already started building permanent structures here. That alone is extraordinary. They weren't just simple huts either. Many of these dwellings were round, made of clay and straw, and featured built-in hearths right in the center of the home. Some were even plastered and decorated. And what really grabs your attention is how people treated their dead. In some homes, archaeologists found actual human skulls that had been coated with plaster to recreate the features of the deceased. Shells were used to represent the eyes. These skulls were often displayed, possibly venerated, as if the people were preserving not just memory, but identity, lineage, maybe even spiritual presence. It's one of the earliest signs we have of ancestor worship or ritualized remembrance. And Jericho wasn't the only place this kind of settled life was emerging. Over in modern-day Turkey, not far from Göbekli Tepe, another remarkable site began to take shape, Çatalhöyük. This was a full-blown town of connected dwellings, arranged in a honeycomb-like pattern. There were no streets, instead, people walked across rooftops and entered homes through holes in the ceiling. Inside these homes, they painted walls with images of animals and people, buried their dead under the floors, and constructed platforms for cooking, working, and sleeping. These homes weren't just for shelter, they were dynamic, multifunctional spaces that reflect a society getting used to living together in close quarters. What's fascinating is that Catalhoyuk doesn't appear to have had much in the way of social hierarchy. There were no palaces, no temples towering over the rest. The homes are roughly the same size. It suggests a kind of early egalitarianism, a society without kings or chiefs, at least, not yet. But there were symbols everywhere, bulls' heads mounted on walls, geometric designs, and murals. So, while there may not have been political power structures, spiritual or cultural leadership was clearly important. It's easy to forget how experimental these societies were. Living in one place year-round was a new idea. Growing food? Still a work in progress. These people were figuring it out as they went. Learning how to store grain, keep animals, manage waste, avoid disease. Everything from architecture to family roles was evolving. Now let's zoom out a bit, to the broader Fertile Crescent. This arc of land stretching from the Nile through the Levant and down into Mesopotamia was one of the best places in the world to make the leap into agriculture. With rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates providing water and fertile soil, it became a hotspot for early farming communities. One of the small but important villages in this region was Jarma, in modern-day Iraq. It may not be as well known as Jericho or Catalhoyuk, but it played a critical role. Around 9,000 years ago, people here were already growing wheat and barley, keeping goats, and making pottery. The houses were rectangular this time, built with stone foundations and mud brick walls. Unlike earlier circular homes, these more angular layouts reflected growing permanence and planning. Another interesting feature of this period was the rise of communal storage, places to hold food, tools, maybe even surplus harvests. That might not sound like a big deal, but it marks a major shift. When you have storage, you can plan for the future. You can trade, you can survive a bad season. It also means someone has to manage the storage, and that's where roles and responsibilities begin to differentiate. But life wasn't all about farming and building. Spirituality remained central. At many of these sites, especially in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, archaeologists have found structures thought to be ceremonial or religious in nature. Pillars arranged in circles, carvings of animals and abstract symbols, figurines of fertility goddesses. These weren't just homes, they were communities with belief systems, myths, and probably rituals that helped people make sense of a changing world. And let's not forget the role of art. Even without writing, people expressed themselves. They made figurines from clay, carved bone and stone, painted on walls, and buried objects with symbolic meaning. One such object is known as the Ain Sakri Lovers, a small stone sculpture found in a cave near Bethlehem. It's estimated to be around 11,000 years old and is considered the oldest known depiction of a couple in an intimate embrace. It's delicate, abstract, and powerful, proof that love, sex, and human connection were as deeply felt back then as they are now. What's amazing is how rapidly all of this happened. Just a few thousand years earlier, people were hunting mammoths and living in temporary shelters. Now they were living in multi-room homes, growing crops, raising animals, and sculpting works of art. It wasn't just survival, it was innovation, creativity, and emotion woven into daily life. And this wasn't isolated to just the Fertile Crescent. Around the same time, other parts of the world, like Egypt, the Sahara, and the Nile Valley, were also beginning to transform. Let's turn our attention now to Africa, specifically, the Sahara. Today, it's one of the driest and most inhospitable places on Earth. But 10,000 years ago, it was a completely different world. Thanks to changes in Earth's orbit, a climatic shift known as the African Humid Period transformed the Sahara into a green, thriving landscape. Rainfall increased dramatically. What had been endless dunes and desert became vast grasslands, wetlands, and even lakes. The Sahara was alive, with rivers flowing, animals grazing, and people moving in. It was the perfect environment for hunter-gatherer groups to flourish. In these fertile zones, people lived by hunting game, gathering wild grains, and fishing in the abundant rivers and lakes. One of the best-known cultures from this era is the Caption culture of North Africa. These people left behind an astonishing array of rock art, paintings and engravings found across modern-day Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and beyond. These images weren't just decorative. They tell stories of daily life, hunting scenes, dances, animals, and spiritual figures. One of the most iconic is a depiction known as the Running Horned Woman, painted in a cave in Algeria. She's wearing what appears to be ritual body paint or ceremonial garb, surrounded by a halo of dots. Is she a goddess? A shaman? A warrior? No one knows for sure, but the image is powerful. Another site, located in the Akakus Mountains of Libya, reveals scenes of large animals and group hunts. These paintings show giraffes, elephants, antelope, even what appeared to be crocodiles and hippos. Clearly, the region was once rich in biodiversity. The fact that these animals were so prominent in art shows how closely these people lived with nature, and how much they depended on it. It wasn't just North Africa that was transformed during this green period. West Africa also saw major ecological and cultural development. Rainforests and savannas expanded. Rivers like the Niger and Senegal created fertile basins where people could thrive. Early groups here developed complex ways of managing the land and began to influence their environment in subtle but lasting ways. One example of this influence comes from Central Africa, where groups like the Pygmy populations and the even more ancient Khoisan began to diverge from other humans tens of thousands of years ago. By 10,000 years ago, these populations were still living throughout the forests and grasslands of Central and Southern Africa. Their small stature is thought to have been an evolutionary adaptation to dense forest environments. Even today, genetic research shows just how ancient and unique these groups are. The San people, for instance, carry some of the oldest known human DNA lineages, connecting modern humanity directly to our earliest ancestors. And while many still lived as nomadic foragers 10,000 years ago, they had already developed a deep knowledge of their environment, sophisticated tracking skills, and oral traditions that passed down stories, history, and even cosmology. Moving east to the Nile Valley, we find another hotspot of human activity. While Egypt's Great Pyramids were still thousands of years in the future, the Nile had already become a hub for Mesolithic life. The river's predictable flooding made the land incredibly fertile, and early communities took full advantage of that. Archaeologists have found fishing hooks made of bone, barbed points for spears, and even piles of thousands of fish bones, evidence of active and efficient food gathering. Ostrich eggs were used as water containers, and people buried their dead in shallow graves, sometimes with tools or personal items. These weren't just scattered bands of wanderers, these were communities with ritual, memory, and innovation. Interestingly, some scholars believe that early Nile Valley groups influenced or even contributed to the rise of agriculture in the Levant and Fertile Crescent. Trade routes and migrations could have allowed ideas and practices to flow back and forth between regions, shaping the development of early farming societies. And these weren't the only Africans making their mark. In what's now Kenya, near Lake Turkana, a place often referred to as the cradle of humanity, something darker occurred around 10,000 years ago. At a site called Naturik, archaeologists discovered the remains of 27 individuals who appeared to have been the victims of a violent conflict. Some were bound, others had fatal injuries, blows to the head, embedded arrow points. There were women, children, and even a pregnant woman among the dead. This wasn't a random accident. It was a massacre. This discovery is one of the oldest known examples of intergroup violence. It challenges the notion that warfare only began with agriculture and settlement. Even mobile hunter-gatherers, at least sometimes, clashed over territory, resources, or revenge. It's a sobering reminder that the full range of human behavior, kindness, creativity, conflict, has existed for tens of thousands of years. Despite this, much of what we see in early African cultures is a story of harmony with the land. People didn't just live off the environment, they were part of it. They developed systems for tracking animals, collecting seasonal plants, and navigating rivers. And through it all, they made art, told stories, and left traces that still speak to us today. So while Europe was building stone walls for reindeer hunts and the Middle East was stacking mud bricks for early homes, Africa was blooming, green, fertile, and alive with culture. The Sahara wasn't a desert. It was a savanna, and in its grasslands and lakes, some of the earliest chapters of human civilization were being written. As we leave Africa behind, our journey takes us east, to the wild, untamed landscapes of ancient East Asia. This region, too, was undergoing its own unique transformation around 10,000 years ago. While farming hadn't yet fully taken hold, the people of East Asia were already developing rich, sustainable lifestyles based on the abundance of their environment. Let's start in Japan, where the Jomon culture was beginning to emerge. The Jomon are often credited with creating some of the world's oldest known pottery, dating back to as early as 14,000 years ago, and continuing for thousands of years after that. These early ceramic vessels weren't just functional, they were works of art. Coiled, stamped, and sometimes elaborately decorated, they were likely used for storing food, cooking, and possibly ritual purposes. The Jomon people lived in coastal areas, forests, and river valleys. They hunted deer and wild boar, fished rivers and oceans, and gathered acorns, nuts, and edible roots. They built semi-permanent pit dwellings, often clustered in small communities. These early homes were dug into the earth, with thatched roofs supported by wooden beams, a perfect shelter for Japan's cool, wet climate. Because of the rich natural resources, the Jomon didn't need to farm right away. The land gave them everything they needed: meat, fish, plants, and fresh water. Middens, or ancient trash heaps, containing thousands of shells, bones, and pottery shards, show how deeply rooted they were in their local environments. Some of these middens are so massive they suggest communities remained in place for generations. And while they didn't rely on agriculture in the way later societies would, they did begin managing the environment. Some researchers suggest the Jomon may have engaged in low-level forest management, even planting certain tree species like chestnut to increase food yields. It wasn't full-scale farming, but it was an intentional way of shaping the land to better meet their needs. Their art is another clue to how advanced their culture was. The Jomon created clay figurines known as dogu, small, humanoid statues with exaggerated features and mysterious markings. Some appeared to be wearing masks or goggles. Others seemed to represent fertility, childbirth, or protection. No one knows exactly what they meant, but they clearly held spiritual or ritual significance. Across the sea in mainland China, another major transformation was beginning to take place. In the fertile valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, the first signs of domesticated plants were emerging. Around 10,000 years ago, people began cultivating millet in the north and rice in the south. These early Chinese communities lived in small villages and began experimenting with basic farming techniques. Millet, a drought-resistant grain, was particularly well suited to the dry plains of northern China. In the humid south, wild rice grew in abundance, and over time, people began to select and manage the best strains. Eventually, this led to the full domestication of rice, which would become one of the world's most important staple crops. But even as agriculture developed, people still relied heavily on hunting and gathering. Wild pigs, deer, bears, and birds were common prey. Fishing remained essential in river and lake regions. Like their neighbors in Japan, these early farmers lived in pit houses and used polished stone tools, axes, hoes, and adzes, to manage their fields. One fascinating aspect of early Chinese settlements is the appearance of ritual and burial practices. Some graves from this period contain pottery, tools, and even food offerings, suggesting a belief in an afterlife or a spiritual world. Painted ceramics and engraved stones begin to appear, hinting at a growing symbolic language. This time in East Asia also saw the beginning of early social structures. While we don't see rigid class systems yet, some individuals were buried with more goods than others. That's an early sign of status, wealth, or spiritual importance. It's subtle, but it shows that as people settled down, their societies were beginning to grow more complex. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia and the island chains of the Pacific, other groups were adapting to tropical forests, rivers, and coastlines. These people relied on root crops, fruits, and fish, building stilt houses above floodplains and using dugout canoes to navigate long waterways. It's important to remember that while some cultures were just beginning to experiment with farming, others were perfecting ways to thrive without it. The abundance of natural resources in East and Southeast Asia allowed for a wide range of lifeways, some settled, some semi-nomadic, all highly adapted to their environments. What ties these early Asian cultures together isn't just their innovation, it's their deep relationship with the land. Whether it was the forests of Japan, the rivers of China, or the jungles of Vietnam and Indonesia, these ancient peoples understood their ecosystems. They weren't just living in nature, they were part of it. And while cities and empires were still far off, the roots of those civilizations were already being laid. People were building homes, burying their dead, making pottery, shaping tools, and leaving behind art that still speaks to us across millennia. So as Europe raised stone walls and the Sahara bloomed with green, East Asia was quietly preparing for one of the most enduring cultural stories in human history. One that would unfold over the next 10,000 years. Now let's journey to the far edge of the ancient world, Australia and New Guinea. These lands, separated from the rest of the continents by ocean and time, tell one of the most remarkable stories of human survival, adaptation, and continuity on Earth. By 10,000 years ago, the first peoples of Australia had already been living on the continent for tens of thousands of years. Estimates vary, but some evidence points to their arrival at least 50,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. That makes Aboriginal Australians one of the oldest continuous cultures on the planet. What's extraordinary is how deeply their knowledge and traditions became embedded in the land itself. Through a complex oral tradition known as the dreaming, or dreamtime, stories were passed down for countless generations. These were not just myths or legends. They were maps, ecological records, moral codes, and spiritual truths all woven into one. And remarkably, some dreamtime stories describe events that appear to match geological changes from 10,000 years ago, like the rising of the seas and the submergence of land now beneath the ocean. It's easy to overlook oral tradition as a form of history, but these stories, told across generations and often tied to specific places, may be among the longest-running records of landscape memory anywhere on Earth. During this time, the climate across Australia was changing. As the last ice age ended, melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically, by nearly 100 meters in some areas. Entire land bridges vanished beneath the waves. One such area was the land that once connected mainland Australia to Tasmania. As seas rose, Tasmania became isolated, and the people who lived there were cut off for thousands of years. Despite this isolation, Aboriginal Australians continued to adapt. Their lifestyles were incredibly diverse. In some regions, people hunted kangaroo and emu across open grasslands. In others, they fished rivers and coasts or foraged in tropical rainforests. They used fire stick farming, controlled burns that shaped the land, promoted new growth, and made hunting easier. This wasn't primitive living, it was ecological mastery. And the art? Stunning. In places like Kakadu National Park, you'll find ancient rock paintings that stretch back over 10,000 years. Some are layered, showing different styles and stories across thousands of years. Some show animals no longer seen in the region. Others depict early tools, hunting scenes, or mythological figures, like lightning spirits and creator beings. Many of the oldest paintings are simple silhouettes, often painted in red ochre. Over time, new styles emerged, including X-ray art that showed not just the outside of animals, but their bones and organs. It was an artistic tradition unlike anything else on Earth, deeply tied to knowledge, environment, and the dreaming. Just north of Australia, the highlands of New Guinea were undergoing their own quiet revolution. Although isolated by mountains and dense jungle, people here independently developed agriculture, one of the few places in the world where this happened without outside influence. In the swampy valleys of the New Guinea highlands, early agricultural drainage systems have been found dating back nearly 9,000 years. These systems were used to grow root crops like taro and yams, which formed the base of a stable diet. Unlike the wheat and barley of the Middle East or the millet of China, these crops weren't planted in neat rows. Instead, the land was shaped, mounded, drained, and carefully tended to ensure the right balance of water and nutrients. This form of agriculture wasn't flashy, but it was incredibly effective. It allowed people to settle, build villages, and establish lasting communities deep in one of the world's most challenging environments. And like Australia, New Guinea was home to complex spiritual systems and artistic expression. Though less is preserved in the rock art of the highlands, oral traditions, carvings, and ceremonial practices suggest a deeply symbolic worldview. Ancestors, spirits, and natural forces were all part of everyday life, honored in rituals, songs, and seasonal celebrations. What's also striking about these regions is how self-contained they remained. While Eurasia saw waves of migration, trade, and conquest, Australia and New Guinea were relatively insulated. This allowed cultures to evolve along their own timelines, shaped primarily by environment rather than empire. Even so, there's evidence of some ancient seafaring knowledge. Aboriginal Australians are believed to have reached their continent via maritime routes tens of thousands of years ago, and they likely retained a deep understanding of tides, currents, and navigation, skills passed down through generations of coastal dwellers. There are also oral stories from Aboriginal groups that speak of submerged lands, lost islands, and shifting shorelines. In recent years, researchers have begun to take these stories more seriously, not just as myth, but as potential records of real, ancient events tied to post-glacial sea rise. So, while the rest of the world was building megaliths, planting grains, and shaping copper tools, the people of Australia and New Guinea were doing something just as remarkable: preserving ancient knowledge, shaping ecosystems without destroying them, and building cultures that would last for tens of thousands of years. In many ways, they weren't behind the rest of the world. They were following a different path, one rooted not in cities or empires, but in land, memory, and balance. Now let's cross the Pacific and explore what was unfolding across the vast and diverse landscapes of the Americas, where ancient cultures were beginning to rise from the Arctic Circle to the southern tip of Patagonia. In North America, the end of the last ice age brought sweeping changes. As glaciers retreated, vast stretches of new land opened up: grasslands, forests, lakes, and river valleys. The people who lived here were mobile hunter-gatherers, following herds of animals and foraging for seasonal plants. But these weren't isolated bands of survivors, they were skilled, innovative, and increasingly organized. In what is now the western United States, archaeologists have uncovered some remarkable traces of life from this period. One of the most famous finds comes from Fort Rock, Oregon: dozens of 10,000-year-old sandals woven from sagebrush bark. They come in all sizes, adult, child, even toddler, and show clear signs of wear. These weren't ceremonial items, they were everyday clothing. It's such a human detail, someone carefully weaving footwear for their family in the shelter of a cave. Nearby, at sites like Paisley Caves in the Great Basin, researchers have found tools, animal bones, and even traces of ancient human DNA, all pointing to well-established communities with complex seasonal routines. People hunted deer, bighorn sheep, and bison. They fished, gathered seeds and roots, and likely stored food for the leaner months. Further north, in Alaska, at a site known as Upward Sun River, archaeologists made a haunting discovery. They uncovered the graves of two infants, buried beneath a cremated young adult. The infants had been carefully laid to rest with grave goods and covered in red ochre, a substance used across the ancient world in burials, possibly as a symbol of blood, life, or rebirth. This site tells us a lot. It wasn't just about survival. It was about family, ritual, and meaning. These people were honoring their dead, telling stories, and passing down identities long before any written word. Meanwhile, on the Great Plains and in the Rockies, humans were thriving alongside some of North America's largest animals. Bison herds exploded in number during this period, and people developed new strategies to hunt them, driving them into narrow valleys or over cliffs, coordinating efforts to provide food for whole communities. Over in the Great Lakes region, something remarkable was happening with metal. The glaciers had left behind massive chunks of pure copper, called float copper, scattered across the region. And around 10,000 years ago, people started working it. They didn't smelt or melt it yet, but they used cold hammering techniques to shape it into tools, fishhooks, awls, and ornamental pieces. This early copper use marks one of the first times humans anywhere in the world began manipulating metal. Further south, in the Mississippi River Valley and beyond, the Dalton culture was flourishing. Known for their fluted projectile points, spear tips shaped with skill and precision, they were some of the last to carry the torch of Paleo-Indian stone tool traditions. Some of their tools were resharpened and reused until they were nothing more than stubs. Others were turned into drills, scrapers, or adzes, a woodworking tool. These were efficient people, who made the most out of every resource. The story doesn't stop with North America. In Central and South America, changes were underway that would shape human life for millennia to come. In modern-day Mexico and parts of Central America, people were beginning to experiment with cultivating local plants, like squash, chili peppers, and maize. The domestication of maize, in particular, would be one of the most transformative events in human history. But at this point, 10,000 years ago, maize was still in its wild form, teosinte. It didn't look much like the golden cobs we know today. But the journey had begun. Even without full-scale agriculture, Mesoamerican communities were forming seasonal camps and returning to the same sites again and again. Over time, these would become the foundations of settled villages, and eventually cities. Farther south, in Brazil, one site stands out: Pedra Furada. Here, cave paintings date back as far as 12,000 years ago and continue well into the 7,000-year range. These vivid images show animals, hunting scenes, and strange humanoid figures, some with horns, others with elaborate headdresses. The art is deeply symbolic, reflecting a world of myth, ritual, and spiritual meaning. Another site in Patagonia reveals a unique and often overlooked chapter of early American life. In the Cueva de los Manos, Cave of the Hands, the walls are covered with stenciled handprints made by spraying pigment around outstretched fingers. These prints are haunting, intimate, and incredibly old, some over 9,000 years old. They speak to identity, presence, and perhaps a desire to leave a mark on the world. Meanwhile, in the Andean highlands, early groups were adapting to extreme elevations. They hunted guanacos and vicuñas, ancestors of the modern llama and alpaca. Even this early, there are hints that people may have started to manage herds of these animals, though full domestication would come later. And on the shores of Lake Titicaca and along the Pacific coast of Peru and Chile, early fishing cultures were developing. Using bone hooks, nets, and perhaps rafts, these communities thrived on the ocean's bounty. They also left behind petroglyphs and stone tools, evidence of a vibrant and resourceful life. Finally, in Kenya's Lake Turkana region, often called the cradle of humanity, one of the oldest known massacres took place at the site of Naturik. Around 10,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers was ambushed and killed. The victims included men, women, and children. Some were bound, others struck with weapons. It's a chilling reminder that even in prehistoric times, violence and conflict were part of the human story. But violence wasn't the whole story, not even close. Across the Americas, people were building, learning, experimenting, and expressing themselves. From copper tools in the north to cave art in the south, they were crafting worlds full of meaning and memory. As we near the end of our global exploration, let's return to Siberia, a region once dominated by mammoths, now revealing some of the most poetic endings of the Ice Age. Around 10,000 years ago, the last of the great woolly mammoths were disappearing from the Eurasian mainland. For thousands of years, these enormous creatures had walked alongside humans, hunted, painted on cave walls, and remembered in ancient memory. Most mammoth populations in Siberia vanished by about 9,650 years ago. But even that wasn't the absolute end. On remote Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, a small isolated group of mammoths survived for several more millennia, finally going extinct around 4,000 years ago, around the same time as the pyramids of Egypt were being built. It's incredible to think that while pharaohs ruled along the Nile, the last mammoths were quietly breathing their final breaths far to the north, cut off from the wider world. Still, around 10,000 years ago, human groups across Siberia were interacting with the very last of these great beasts. And they weren't just hunting them, they were also honoring them. In the Upper Paleolithic and early Mesolithic sites of Russia and Eastern Europe, we find elaborate carvings, symbolic objects, and signs of ritual behavior. One of the most fascinating artifacts is the Shigir idol, discovered in the peat bogs of the Ural Mountains. Carved from a single larch tree, this totem-like sculpture stands over 5 meters tall and is estimated to be more than 11,000 years old, making it the oldest known wooden statue in the world. Its surface is covered in strange geometric designs and humanoid faces. Scholars believe it was a sacred object, possibly linked to ancestor worship or a spiritual worldview. The Shigir idol is so unusual, it's often compared to the totem poles of the Pacific Northwest. And yet, it predates those by several thousand years. It's a reminder that even this far back, humans were creating symbols, stories, and cosmologies that tried to explain their world. And what a world it was! With the glaciers gone and new forests growing across Europe and Asia, animals like elk, moose, wild boar, bears, and wolves began to expand their range. Humans followed them, hunting, adapting, experimenting. In some areas, people began building permanent or semi-permanent homes, storing food, and shaping the land in more deliberate ways. At sites like Lepenski Vir, in what is now Serbia, people constructed trapezoidal stone houses overlooking the Danube River. These homes weren't just shelters, they were part of a planned village layout, built with an eye for symmetry and flow. Some of the houses even contained carved stone altars, suggesting a place not only to live but to pray, remember, and honor. Further east, near the Black Sea and into the Caucasus Mountains, other Mesolithic groups were experimenting with the earliest forms of agriculture. They didn't fully abandon foraging, but they began tending to wild grains, domesticating animals, and storing seasonal food. These were quiet, slow transformations, but they would lay the groundwork for the Neolithic explosion that would follow. Meanwhile, in what we now call the Levant, the cradle of civilization, permanent settlements like Jericho were already forming. At Jericho, the walls went up early, literally. One of the world's first known stone towers and defensive walls was constructed here around 10,000 years ago. This wasn't just a village, it was a place of organized labor, engineering, and long-term planning. People at Jericho lived in circular houses built of clay and straw. They created art, they built hearths, and they buried their dead beneath their homes. In some cases, they even reconstructed the faces of the deceased, covering their skulls in plaster, adding shells for eyes. These weren't just graves, they were memorials, a way of keeping loved ones close and perhaps believing they still had a role in the daily life of the community. Farther to the north, in what is now southeastern Turkey, the monumental site of Göbekli Tepe stood like a riddle in stone. Though slightly older than our 10,000-year mark, it was still active during this period. Enormous T-shaped pillars, weighing up to 20 tons, were carved and arranged in circular enclosures. Each stone bore intricate carvings of animals, lions, vultures, snakes, boars, some shown in dynamic motion, others locked in still, almost meditative poses. Göbekli Tepe defies easy explanation. Built before agriculture fully took hold, it challenges the idea that religion followed farming. Instead, it suggests that spiritual belief may have come first, that the desire to worship, to gather, to build sacred space, might have been the catalyst for organized labor and eventually farming. What connects all of these places, from Siberia to the Levant, is a common thread of innovation, creativity, and meaning-making. These were not people merely surviving, they were imagining, constructing, worshipping, and remembering. They created music, likely with drums, flutes, and rhythmic chants. They painted animals and spirits on cave walls. They built tools with precision and care. They raised monuments to the unseen. And perhaps most importantly, they told stories. Around hearths, under stars, by rivers, and across valleys, they passed down memories that still echo in languages, myths, and symbols today. So, what were humans doing 10,000 years ago? They were doing what we still do today: building homes, raising families, honoring the dead, telling stories, shaping the land, and looking to the sky with questions. The world was shifting, and they were ready. As the world settled into a warmer, more stable climate after the Ice Age, one of the most profound transformations in human history began to unfold: agriculture. And it didn't just start in one place. It emerged independently in multiple regions across the globe, each following its own path, shaped by geography, local plants, and culture. Let's begin in the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped strip of land stretching from modern-day Iraq and Syria into Turkey and Iran. Here, the wild ancestors of wheat, barley, lentils, and peas grew in abundance. As early as 10,000 years ago, small communities began to do something radically different. Instead of merely gathering what nature offered, they started cultivating it. Villages like Jarma in northern Iraq show signs of early farming and animal domestication. People were planting crops, storing grain in baskets, and selectively breeding goats and sheep. Tools like sickles and grinding stones became essential parts of daily life. These tools weren't just for convenience, they represented a shift in how people thought about food, time, and survival. Farming wasn't adopted overnight. For many communities, it coexisted with foraging for thousands of years. But once the benefits became clear: reliable food, storage surpluses, the ability to support larger populations, agriculture spread rapidly. With agriculture came permanent settlements. People stopped moving with the seasons and began building homes that would last. Clay and mud brick houses formed early villages. Paths became streets, storage pits became granaries, and slowly, the idea of private property, social roles, and even leadership began to take root. But the Fertile Crescent wasn't the only region experiencing this agricultural awakening. Thousands of kilometers away, in the lush and once green Sahara, a very different scene was unfolding. Yes, the Sahara, the desert we now associate with sand and sun, was once a verdant, green paradise. Between 12,000 and 5,000 years ago, the region experienced what scientists call the African humid period. Rainfall increased dramatically, lakes swelled, and grasslands stretched across what's now one of the driest places on Earth. During this time, Mesolithic cultures like the Caption people thrived. They hunted antelope and gazelle, fished the abundant rivers and lakes, and created a rich tradition of cave and rock art. One particularly stunning image is that of the running horned woman in the Tassili Najar region of Algeria, a painted figure adorned with body paint and ceremonial dress, possibly part of a ritual or dance. People here weren't farming in the same way as the Fertile Crescent, but they were adapting their environment, building fishing camps, crafting barbed bone hooks, and creating social structures that supported large gatherings. They even used ostrich eggs as water containers: clever, portable, and durable. Moving west into sub-Saharan Africa, the story continues with the ancestors of the Pygmy and Khoisan peoples. These groups maintained foraging lifestyles for tens of thousands of years, relying on deep environmental knowledge. The Khoisan, in particular, are one of the oldest genetic lineages on Earth, having diverged from other human populations more than 100,000 years ago. Even without agriculture, their lives were rich with song, tradition, and adaptation. Their rock art, such as the engravings in the Drakensberg Mountains, reflects not only daily life but complex spiritual beliefs, including trance dances and ancestral connections. Across the ocean in the Americas, similar revolutions were quietly unfolding. Though the Americas lacked large draft animals like oxen or horses, humans still found ways to domesticate the land. In the highlands of Peru, they cultivated potatoes and quinoa. In the lowlands, squash, beans, and maize were beginning their journey from wild plants to staple crops. In the Amazon, evidence now suggests that even seemingly untouched rainforest was managed by early human hands. Certain tree species, like Brazil nuts and cacao, are far more common near ancient settlements, hinting at long-term ecological shaping. People were creating food forests before the concept even existed. One of the most intriguing agricultural discoveries comes from New Guinea, where independent crop domestication took place. In the highland swamps, early peoples developed a system of agriculture based on taro, yams, and bananas. They built intricate drainage canals, allowing them to control water levels and grow crops in the dense wetland terrain. This type of farming didn't produce vast grain fields, but it fed entire communities. And because of the mountainous geography, these communities remained isolated, preserving unique languages, beliefs, and plant varieties for thousands of years. Across East Asia, along the banks of the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, early rice and millet farming was also beginning to take shape. In southern China, wild rice was slowly being transformed into cultivated varieties. In the north, millet, the grain of ancient empires, was being harvested, stored, and shared. With the rise of farming, something else changed: time. For hunter-gatherers, time was measured by migration, animal movements, and seasonal cues. For farmers, time became cyclical, bound to planting and harvest. Calendars were born, rituals timed to the moon and sun emerged. The concept of planning months or years ahead took root. Farming also demanded cooperation. Irrigation systems required groups to work together. Storage required protection. Surpluses meant trade, and inevitably, inequality. Some individuals or families began accumulating more food, more land, or more influence. Hierarchies began to form. This wasn't always a negative shift, but it was a major change from the more egalitarian life of small bands. Art, too, evolved. No longer limited to mobile tools and cave walls, people now had time, space, and materials to create pottery, engravings, and ceremonial objects. Clay figurines, often depicting fertility or motherhood, began appearing across Neolithic sites. Symbolism became rooted not just in survival, but in prosperity, fertility, and the cycles of life. In short, the world was changing. Humans were settling down, not just physically, but mentally. They were building futures, plotting them into fields, carving them into stone, passing them on to children. As we bring this journey to a close, it's worth pausing to reflect on just how much was happening across the world 10,000 years ago, and how much of it still echoes through our lives today. By this time, humans were no longer just surviving. We were thriving. We had moved beyond merely reacting to the environment. We had started reshaping it. In multiple regions, we domesticated plants and animals, altering ecosystems in ways that would never return to their original state. We made tools that lasted generations, built homes that stood for centuries, and created symbols meant to outlive even memory. But most importantly, we were creating culture. Whether it was the Shigir idol in the Ural Mountains or the running horned woman in the Sahara, whether it was the circular dwellings of Jericho or the reindeer hunting walls beneath the Baltic Sea, each structure, each painting, each burial was an expression of something deeper. These were people trying to understand who they were, where they came from, and what they owed to those who came before them. They built monuments not just for function, but for meaning. They painted their dreams. They buried their dead with care. They created tools so refined, they could cut, carve, build, and defend with elegance and efficiency. They shaped the first myths, the stories told around firelight that tried to explain the stars, the storms, the animals, and the spirits of the forest. They named the constellations. They tracked the moon. They began to ask questions that would lead, slowly, to philosophy, religion, and science. And yet, despite all the changes, much of life still revolved around the same ancient rhythms: birth, death, migration, hunger, love, fear, and wonder. This was a world where giant mammals still roamed, mammoths in the north, giant sloths in South America, massive bison in the plains. But it was also a world where those giants were vanishing, driven to extinction by climate change, shifting landscapes, and increasingly efficient human hunters. This was a world where the sea was still lower, exposing coastlines now long submerged. Many of the places where early humans gathered, lived, and built their lives are now beneath the ocean. Doggerland, for example, the land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, was still a thriving wetland dotted with rivers, forests, and game. Now, it's lost beneath the waves of the North Sea. We can't hear the voices of those who lived there, but we can see their footprints in ancient peat, find their tools in submerged mud, and feel their presence in the stories we still tell. Even today, echoes of this time remain. The languages we speak carry fragments of roots that may go back thousands of years. The foods we eat, wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, were all first cultivated by communities during this pivotal period. The way we organize time, track the seasons, and celebrate harvests is built on traditions that began in the Neolithic. Even our spiritual impulses, the urge to create, to gather, to mark sacred ground, come from these earliest expressions of belief and belonging. And though it's easy to feel distant from these ancient people, the truth is that they were fundamentally like us. They laughed, they loved, they mourned, they hoped. They faced danger and loss, but also wonder and discovery. They looked at the stars and asked the same questions we still ask today. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What will happen after we're gone? And perhaps the most profound realization of all is this: much of what defines us as human was already present 10,000 years ago. Innovation, memory, art, community, ceremony, curiosity. Those who lived during this time were not the prelude to civilization, they were civilization, in its earliest and most beautiful form. They laid the groundwork for everything that came after: the rise of cities, the birth of writing, the formation of empires, and the development of science. And even today, in our high-tech, fast-moving world, their legacy remains, etched in stone, buried in the earth, whispered through the bones of ancient settlements. So when we ask, what were humans doing 10,000 years ago? We're not just looking back, we're looking inward. We were becoming who we are. And maybe that's the most extraordinary part of all. The realization that this story, this long, winding, beautiful human story, is still being written. Right now, by us.